Hello and welcome to the Xianniang Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute. And along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Xianniang Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the human experience, following the footsteps of our founder, anthropologist Dr. Flourishes Goodman. And as an educational institution, we recognize to thrive, we must take an open approach. So we invite scholars in related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. And that's why we call these discussions Conversation for Exploration. On these weekly Sunday discussions, we've had a full spectrum of topics, from the arts to the sciences, and everything in between. And you're welcome to visit our website at xiannianginstitute.com. All of these presentations are free, and as a nonprofit, we invite you to become a supporting member. We thank those who are community members who are already supporting the mission of the Xianniang Institute. Let's return and continue our exploration of shamanism. Let's start with a quick definition. Shamanism is a spiritual practice that involves a practitioner, a specialist, who communicates with the spirit world via an altered state of consciousness, such as trance. Generally, the intention of the shaman is to communicate and direct these spirits or spiritual energies into the physical world for healing, divination, and other purposes to serve the community. Shamanism and its roots are found in cultures and countries around the world, and the development of traditional music, theater, and dance can find its roots back to the practice of shamanism. We know that shamanic practices have a prehistoric tradition dating back to the hunter-gatherer and the Paleolithic cultures. Looking at the cave art that's more than 40,000 years old, we see some of the earliest evidence of shamanic practices. And we now suspect that much older evidence will continue to be discovered. Today, our guest provides us with a unique opportunity to go deep into the mountains of southwestern China and visit a spiritual tradition said to be thousands of years old, and it's still flourishing. And here at the core and the power of their rituals, they structure balance. Male and female each have equal roles in sustaining and maintaining the balance of their village. So we are quite excited to undertake this journey together.
Well, we're very excited to have Thomas Riccio, who is a professor of performing arts and theater at the University of Texas in Dallas, with us. He knows the founder, Flourishes Goodman, spent a week working with her back in the early 90s. He travels the world and works with various ethnic groups to use their history, their mythology, their artifacts, their indigenous wisdom, and make it relevant for today in a performance. And his world travels, as you said, Paul, include China, which we'll look at today, but also he just returned from Prague and from the Zeus cave in Greece, or the Zeus Island rather, in Greece. And he's also teaching shamanism in his at his university. So some wonderful in-depth work. Theater, as you mentioned, is really, what is it? Masks, costumes, song, chants, gesture, story, mythology. It's really such a shamanic root. I think the two are so deeply tied together. So look at the elements of theater is also to help us understand our early roots. And Thomas, welcome. Good to have you here. And welcome back. This is Thomas's second visit with us in the Conversation for Exploration.
Welcome.
So tell us about your latest adventures and what you're going to...
Where do we start?
Where are we going to look at today?
Yeah. Thanks, Paul and Laura. It's today I'm going to structure it basically around narrative. And one thing that I've really, I've been doing this maybe for 32 years. And it really just occurred to me when I started working with the Miao people that narrative really ties things in, and actually is a structure. And that narrative, of course, is based on their cosmological worldview. And then embedded within that is the shamanic tradition and then the trance tradition. And the idea of the trance tradition is to locate within the larger narrative something that's transitory, but also something that kind of renews the culture. It's a visioning. structured within a larger cosmological framework. And that's basically the understanding of how I'm looking at shamanism now, in terms of they need, and my attention has been towards understanding the narrative itself. And then where, for instance, shamanism, the trance, as well as the postures fit in. And that was the first, how I encountered Felicitas was basically, I was reading something about these people taking these positions, these shamans, within a larger ritual. And then I called her in Santa Fe, you know, in 1990. And so it was because of not understanding why and how these postures and this trance existed. Now I have a fuller picture. And part of that is because the Miao people have a very strong, let's say, dramatic narrative. In fact, they call them like dramas. They're essentially like ritual dramas. They have a distinct narrative that retraces and reiterates and reaffirms their cultural worldview. And so then if there is an issue that's temporal of this moment, then that's where the trance comes in. And then the idea that the ritual itself becomes trance-like. Many of the rituals take place over a period of several hours, sometimes days. And so it kind of induces a sense of entrainment, of like an altered kind of perception for that short period of time. And then I'll show examples that relate and align to my work in Korea, as well as with the Bushmen, as well as in Alaska. And so I'm seeing these real similarities that kind of continue through various cultures that are almost identical. The uniqueness with the Miao tradition is the fact that they have essentially the badai, which is the male, and I'll explain Yin-Yang in Taoist terms, which they draw from, and then the female, which is primarily the xianniang, who is a trancer. So the badai kind of creates the narrative, and the narrative becomes in itself trance-like, and then within that there are trance moments which are facilitated by the xianniang, or elements within the culture itself that are facilitated by the xianniang. That kind of elaborate and actually advance, because any tradition, any ritual tradition, if it's not growing and evolving, it's basically dying. And so you have to kind of renew it. Otherwise it becomes stagnant and historified. And then it's basically useless and doesn't have a functionality. So it's highly functional, this kind of like this paradigm.
You know, the Australian Aborigines are celebrated for activating their song lines, but that's not unique to them. You're saying that this is a practice and an understanding of keeping a tradition alive, of reenacting it, keeping the wheels of the cosmos flowing is a widespread concept then.
Well, in a way, we do the same in our theater. When we watch a theater production or film, essentially it's a reaffirmation of our worldview. If you look at a film, or a play, there seldom, if ever, are there anything but humans. It's very human-centric, and as a consequence, it's about conflict resolution on a social, human, cultural level or psychological level. And so it basically it identifies the conflict, and then traces it, and we see the movement through that narrative to a resolution. And so we see that as we're watching as viewers, and it's basically reaffirming how we would solve problems in our own life, whether it's something about war, about a relationship, whatever. And so that's our model. But what's excluded is anything beyond the human. There's no non-human beings that are included within that dialogue, unless they're antagonist or something that's detrimental or an obstacle for the human to overcome. So in a way, we do the same thing. We don't see it that way.
But art is a container for our cultural identity and our cultural story, secular or sacred, then and now, you're saying.
Yeah. So
it's one of the vehicles that we talk to each other with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what I'm examining now, my concern in my work now and interest is how, in a sense, to decenter humans. And how do you create and how do you return to something or in a new way, not in a ritual or appropriative way, but how do we create in our urban globalizing world, how do we create something that is not centrally human and is maybe cosmocentric, something that includes a whole variety of voices. And traditionally, we know, of course, someone took on the regalia of an animal and performed the animal, or had animal spirits within the regalia that gave them power or vision. And so we understand it in those terms. In a way, that's what they did. So how do we do that? So my concern is using this information in a very practical way and seeing what the similarities are, and to learn from this basically earth knowledge, and how do we move it forward, and how could we transform our own way of perceiving reality? Because right now we're talking about the environment, we're talking about so many global issues, but we're still kind of talking about it within the framework of an old program. We're kind of still a human-centric program, so that's our view. So we're always kind of locked in. We're kind of bumping our head against something that's much, it's different. So we want to become something, let's say, globally indigenous or earthlings again. Then we have to kind of reframe how we talk to ourselves, and that's kind of the objective of my work, to ethnographically document, which is important part of the work. But then also I do performances with indigenous groups, extrapolating their own tradition into a contemporary context. So that's basically the nutshell of my work with indigenous people.
And it's interesting because we still find that in every experiential session that we do, wisdom comes through, and it's the eternal wisdom that still applies for today. That method works, and it's still speaking to us, just as it did the ancestors. That's something that Goodman claimed, and we find to be very real. And you're working with that very thing. You know, today in your way.
And that whole idea of going and then returning their rituals and their traditions, and amplifying it and showing them a way to enjoy it, even from a different perspective.
In the here and now.
In the here and now.
Make it relevant.
It reminds me of the story of Dr. Goodman, who used to gather up and make puppets for the local Pueblo children to tell them their stories. She would do puppet shows for the Pueblo children. So that's a similar kind of idea.
Another form of theater.
You're right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can move into, and we can dialogue as I move through some of the slides.
Sure.
Let's see your slides.
So basically, that's kind of an overview, and I can elaborate as we get specific. Yeah. So I'll share my screen.
Okay.
Here. So this is the title. It's a kind of a basic overview title, as I prefaced before. And this is kind of like the focus of what we'll be talking about, and how I'll shape the discussion. So basically, trance is a narrative. We know that as we've tranced before, that it turns into a narrative, and humans are very much narrative seeking and narrative defining species. And narrative is a trance. So in a sense, when we read a story, we go into a film or another altered state, or another being, another time and place. In a sense, it's trance-like. It may, on a scale of 1 to 10, it may be a 0.5, but nonetheless, it takes us to another place, into an altered state.
Like suspended disbelief, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's where there are all sorts of corollaries between theater, language, and also the language of a shaman and trance. Yeah. So the myth is the model, always, and I'll elaborate on a few different traditions and intimate about a few different mythologies and how they really shape and influence a ritual and a trance moment. So belief references the myth. So you can have a myth, but if you don't believe it, so it's an important aspect of that. Whether it be Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, Hinduism, if there's not a belief, then it's basically kind of hollow. So it takes a participatory interaction. So trance and ritual, a method of internalizing the myth and tradition. So if the myth basically incarnates vividly and maybe abstractly, and more likely abstractly, or symbolically, archetypally, what it does is it basically encodes the body. Ritual action encodes the sound, the visuals, the arrangement, the sequence of events is basically an encoding. It's a psychophysical encoding. And this, we have to remind ourselves, is primarily because of these traditions evolved, and many of them still are non-literate. So they're basically sensorial traditions. And because we're of the literate culture, we kind of think of the world always being that way and being perceived that way. The Miao, for instance, many of the badais, majority, I'd say 9 out of 10, do not read or write deliberately. And likewise with the xianniangs, these are they're Some have never had the opportunity to go to school, and others actually refuse because they feel language and writing actually gets in between them and their belief and their effectiveness in of their spiritual functions. So the narrative sequence, so how things are sequenced, tells part of the cosmology of the culture. We all know that if a story, if it's not sequenced correctly, is disruptive. We need to see, in a sense, it's less logic. In the Western tradition, we see cause effect, linear progression. But in these traditions, in general, the indigenous shamanic traditions, it's basically a sensorial logic. If in a way, logic's the wrong word. It's sensorial progression that basically encodes the body, and it gives the viewer and the cultural immersion a sense of like how you proceed, which becomes a model for how they look at life, how they carry it into their own world. So there's like a moral value that's encoded as well, in a way of perception that's reasserted again within the ritual. This here is from a Miao ritual, the Huan No Wan, and that's an altar of the peach flower garden. The peach flower garden, it could be a whole like topic just to talk about the peach flower garden, but basically that's their originating site, and there's a whole mythology behind the peach flower garden, which is kind of like, many people think it's one of the origins or a contribution to the whole Shangri-La myth. That's something that existed for 500, 600 years without being noticed, tucked away in the mountains. And if you understand Miao territory geographically, the mountains are twisty and very narrow, these passageways, and you can easily get lost within them. And actually was at the site of the peach flower garden. And except for maybe the first quarter mile of walking in, after that, it becomes a labyrinth. You can see easily how you can get lost within it. And it's heavily overgrown, and now it's like a national park. So it's definitely a germinating place, a site for their cosmology. And then on the right-hand side here, this is a photo that is drawn out for me, and this is the same ritual. And they're dancing the hexagram, which is from the I Ching. And you can, if you know the I Ching, you can see the symbols of the I Ching around it in the center. And the dotted lines there are basically the dance steps that the badai would take to open up the heavens. So even though they're not trancers, they're doing a lot of stuff, and they'll deny. In fact, if you ask them if they did trance, they'll say no, but in a way they do, but maybe don't recognize it as such. So they'll go into maybe dancing the hexagram for like a half hour, 45 minutes, and with instrumentation. And then up at the top there, you see is a table, which is the altar, which is the altar site for the ritual performance. And so they're basically, each one of these is opening up the various heavens. And then in order to do that, they're inviting in the spirits. And because their spirits
gestural language,
it's totally gestural. And the spirits, for them, what they're doing is they're calling the armies, and they're very martial, because this goes into the social, political, historical background. The Miao people fought and resisted the Han as invaders from the north for hundreds of years. And so they became martial, in kind of like their protectors became associated with generals and soldiers to protect them. And so what they're doing is opening up heavens, but also opening up the heavens so these soldiers who have historically, in their cosmological origin time, protected them, are now being called again. Because so they're still there, they're still with them. Much like, and it's not that abstract. In a way, we understand our own relatives. If we're doing something in the world that maybe your grandmother or grandparents are not here, or your ancestors who were in another land that immigrated to the United States, they're still kind of like living with us. And nationally, you can say, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, in this way, are spirits that kind of still live with us, and we call them up. We honor them on certain days. So in a sense, we're doing things in a secular level that they do in a similar but different way on a spiritual level.
Well, we also attach a spiritual mission, the Age of Enlightenment that they were battling for, the freedom that they had, a spiritual context.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a lot of parallels, and they just term it differently, and it's not as, let's say, as alien as we may think. We just do the same thing in a different way, and maybe a larger, like national, non-secular way, but it's nonetheless serving, kind of walking the same patterns.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see here. I'm trying to move ahead here. Let me see. There we go. Now this we played earlier, and there was a little delay on the sound, so maybe I'll just skip this slide. And this is essentially during that the dancing. This is what they're playing in this scene here.
Well, it's working now.
I'm not sure if that's coming through, but I'll over to the next slide. Okay, and within that we'll have similar drumming and gong work. So, like we were talking, I was trying to build on last week's great discussion that Paul initiated and had in his area of rhythm and singing to induce a state of trance. Likewise, you'll find this. I've worked maybe in probably 7 or 8 different cultural settings, and I'm finding this as kind of a parallel across all of those cultural experiences. So rhythmic singing, chanting, drumming, movement, dancing, and rattling, a passageway, and synchronizing with place and community. So it's basically opening up boundaries, passageways. And as I alluded to last week, we talked briefly at the end there, what they're doing is essentially tuning or synchronizing with their place. So it's not only a community, and when we're talking community, I have to remind us that it's a community of place. So it's animals, it's spirits, it's ancestors. And for the Miao people, its ancestors are really prominent, but also the spirits are prominent. Since they're no longer hunter-gatherers, it's less prominent would be animals. Animals are more in the space of like sacrifice, and their blood is needed, for the facilitating it. So it's necessary, but they're not like a co-equal, or they don't interplay in the same way as they might in an indigenous hunter-gatherer setting, such as the Yupik or Nupak Eskimo or the Bushman. So there's a difference there. Because they became farmers and herders, they have adjusted their perception of like animals. Nonetheless, flora is also a big part of it. So flora, the environment, the geography, ancestors are part of their place. So these dancing
like
movements,
the peach flower.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, everything takes place within the peach flower garden that they've transposed into their altar.
Like a Garden of Eden or something. Yeah.
Right. So exactly. So dancing, movements, vocalizations, and rhythm, and a kinesthetic engagement and entrainment. So entrainment's important. It kind of synchronizes. So if there's like 30-some people on this Zoom call right now, if we all kind of listen to one rhythmic movement in terms of like sound or vocalization, chanting, and probably not, what happens in about 5, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, as we all know, is that we start in training, we start feeling the boundaries start breaking. So we're unified and we all kind of entering this one specific space of the rhythm. And we're kind of releasing kind of like our individuality into that. And if the rhythm and the chanting is specific to a culture and has been shaped and formed by the culture and maintained by it, so it has a history as well, emotional history, then it's like you're entering into another, your culture in an abstracted way. So you're on your way to trance, is what I'm saying. And it's culturally specific, windowed state of trance. And this is what I found across various cultures. It serves the same way. Much like when we hear a song from like our high school days, and you're with someone who's also there, it's like you're basically re-entering that moment. And you're in a whole flourishing of like emotions and ideas and images start floating to the fore. And that's just informal. That's kind of like in a commercial, highly individualized cultural setting. So when you can imagine if it's codified and how it engages and basically entrains the participants.
We almost find that it's an open passageway to a field state that is shared. A field state that defies the normal bounds of time and space. We find energetically as a metaphor, you could say. perhaps literal. I don't know.
Well, I should footnote here. I'm very much a pragmatist and a functionalist in my approach. I look at everything in terms of like, how does it really function? What's the mechanics of it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically today's discussion is talking about the mechanics of it that go kind of across cultures. And then there's a real like identifiable similarity, a parallelism that exists, and how they function, how they take you in, and how they found this. Because we got to remind ourselves that indigenous people and hunter-gatherers are incredible functionalists. It has to work.
And
If it doesn't work,
pragmatists.
yeah,
They're
they
not
gotta
going to do something if it doesn't work and serve them.
absolutely, and that's the tradition. That's what's kind of like embedded within this tradition, and that's how I look at it. So everything has a function. If it doesn't have a function, it sloughs off.
And you could say that so many things are shared across the globe and through time because they work. It might be cultural transmission, but also it works. And so you would settle on that. We all share the same physiology.
Whether it's a rave, whether it's a folk dance, whether it's a choral moment in a Catholic church, all these things are openings and engagements that take us to an altered place.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
So smoke, and it's important to mention, smoke becomes really important. And smoking is agreeable to the spirits and ancestors. And it's a linking and communication between human and non-human worlds. Because it's ephemeral and it kind of moves through, and it's something very much material, something's being burnt, and yet it floats to the sky, and the sky is associated with altered states of reality where the spirits live, or into a space. And so smoking becomes a very important part of all these rituals that I'll kind of demonstrate here as we move forward.
So whether it's smudging some dried herbs, or whether it's burning a paper to send your messages and prayers to the gods, it floats up and dissipates. It becomes the ether, becomes the nothing. Yeah.
Or historically burning animal sacrifices. All these things are part of that.
Cremate people to send them to the other side.
Extra too. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me show. This is a xianniang Longsuzhen, and this will demonstrate some of the things that we've been just chatting with, and I can reference it. So I'll pause it here. I wanted to show this, and what's important is she's basically calling ancestors. She's calling her helping spirits. Mm-hmm. And this is the xianniang tradition that I mentioned was female, primarily female. There are very few men who are xianniangs, which means transcendent maiden in the Miao language. And she's wearing a headpiece like many shamans do across the world, something to kind of blind themselves or to darken, because that's where the spirits come. They come out of the darkness. And I interviewed several xianniangs, and they all basically said the same thing, that they need to, like, one, to confine themselves, but also in the darkness is where where the spirits come. They're helping spirits first. And generally within this tradition, this cosmological worldview, there are seven fairies or seven girls, young girls, who come to them and assist them, and will take them to a village, which is basically a parallel to the reality they're in now, but it's an older village. So it's arranged in the same type of village diagramming. And then within that, they'll find if there's someone who is sick, they're in the village, and like soul retrieval, et cetera, will all happen within this context of identifying and moving through the village. And at the gate of the village, there are basically gatekeepers. And then what will, maybe I'll just zoom ahead here on and show you how they're
Can I
burning.
ask one quick question, though?
Please.
She was tapping her feet. So that's where you first mentioned activation of the cerebral spinal fluid, I believe, is showing us something similar. So that's interesting. Also, the covering the eyes, we've experimented with doing our ritual in the dark. And some people prefer to wear eye covering just so that your eyes are not a distraction. Maybe it helps shift the eyes into receiving that dream-like state where that inner screen flips on that we do in dreaming or imagining. Maybe it's some function of preventing the photons from hitting your eyes so that they don't rely on the photons to process, but you're activating another conduit for visionary experiences to get processed in your visual processing center. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think what happens then is other parts of your body compensate. Just like if we're going to a dark room, we bodily, our back, our arms become, and our ears become more sensitized, even smell. Because we're denied that that primary.
You're not relying on that, so it gives a chance for the other sensory input to kick in.
And it's a sensorial interaction. So I would say, yeah, you're absolutely right that that's what it does. Let me just see if I can. I think I'm trying to like show here. They're burning. Let's see here. Right now, I'll just show a little bit of this. They're burning paper. I mentioned smoke. They burn, and this paper is yellow. It's a specific type of paper, and it's called spirit money. And they burn it in order to give propitiations to, at this point in the ritual, give propitiations to the gatekeepers at the gate at the village gate. And basically, if you're wealthy, you can burn more paper because you go to a certain,
it's actual money,
right? So it's not real money, but it's there. So I'll just maybe show maybe a few seconds of this so you can see it. So what you just saw there, she basically, like shamanic traditions elsewhere in the world, they basically channel. She's channeling an ancestor. At first, she's channeling a spirit who's helping her, and she becomes the spirit. And then later, she channels an ancestor. And so there was a woman there who was asking questions about her own ancestors and to engage and to greet them and see how they're doing. And so she's basically speaking as the ancestor who's been dead for maybe 25 years, and if they're all right. People will go to Xianniang for a number of reasons. One is to make sure if someone, especially if someone died accidentally, if a child died, they'll make sure that they're taken care of. If, for instance, or even more practical, if a son or daughter had just graduated from university and they're having a difficult time finding a job, what they want to do is find out why, and then if there are spirits hindering them or their ancestors that are jealous or whatever. And so
clear the path
into it. So it's, kind of like almost, these everyday kind of like concerns as well as larger, life death concerns.
Can we listen to a little bit more of the video?
Sure. Yeah.
She's essentially drumming.
And those are her assistants, all right? They're friends. Some xianniangs, it depends if they're well-known xianniangs, they'll have a designated assistant. Otherwise, they'll just have friends who come with them. And they will basically, here she has two, and they're really feeding the fire there with the money. And as she becomes more involved in her trance, they'll start feeding at a more, a quicker rate. And so sometimes, and I'll show another video with a badai assisting a xianniang and how they'll burn a lot, especially if they're getting closer to it. They kind of sense it.
It's interesting that she's providing that monotone rhythmic beat with her feet, drumming essentially the floor.
Right.
That was interesting.
Yep. Sometimes they'll use like a broom handle or some sort of stick beneath their heels as well. They'll do it that way to change the tonality,
Oh, yeah.
but also, you know, or put it underneath their the front of their feet. So I've seen that as well. Here she's just doing up and down with her feet flat on the ground. Oh, okay. So I wanted to just put this out here, but because we're talking about yin-yang opposites, and for me, we do the same in terms of like antagonist, protagonist. We try to like male, female, but all these things are basically Lao Tzu's understanding, and it's Taoist, yes, but the interaction between the Taoist and the Miao is extensive and intertwining. Some Miao think that it was the Taoists who are written tradition in a more scholarly tradition, basically pulled ideas from the Miao because the Miao
Ah, they were there
uh,
first.
they were
Yeah.
there first, and archaeologically, it's been demonstrated they've been there a long time before anybody else, and they're said to be the first rice cultivators in the world. We're talking like
Wow.
7,000 years ago, archaeological sites, which basically upended the timeline that that had been established about rice and about the Miao's presence. And they were formerly in central China and then pushed out by invasion of the north with the Han, and that had been going on for several thousand years, and then into the mountains where they were safe. But I'll just let you read this on your own, right? But basically, what's important, the yin is stern, and that's kind of where the badai is. So they're kind of the formalists. They're really structured, and I'll show you some badai stuff in a moment here. And they're cold, so they're really like it has to be a certain way. And whereas the yang is the female, is the badai, is the xianniang, and they're hot because they're much more iconoclastic and much more individualized in how they approach and how they interact with the spirits, whereas the badai are very strict. So you kind of have this balance, and they work together. And some badais, some xianniangs are daughters of badais, and many of them are related, and many are interact as well. So it's there. But the Chinese culture, because of Confucius, I have no idea, you know, why, but it's very orderly. You know, circles, squares within circles, within another circle, etc. So everyone has a place, and things need to be maintained in order to maintain the system, and that's how they kind of like a thematic thing that runs throughout the Han as well as the Miao culture. So the stern and cold proceeds from heaven. The flaming hot proceeds from earth. So basically, the shenya is from earth, and the stern and cold, the badai, is from heaven. The two intermingle and penetrate in their form and a union of all things born. So they're basically representatives. The shenya and the badai are basically representatives of these forces, these life forces. Coming together. And so when they interplay, they're basically reasserting and for the moment we're in. So it's like something that's ongoing. They're part of a larger continuity of life and death, the cycles of the world, but they are basically tuning in to that and dipping into that moment of the cycle. And that's their function. And this
You
is
could
from
even
the
you could even call the Confucian the applied order and the Tao the natural order, and those would be opposites as well
absolutely,
in the
absolutely.
dance. Yeah.
You know, and I mean, it goes back to Socrates about balance. I mean, it goes back
Chaos and
to,
order of the Greeks. Yeah.
yep, and then even the rationale for hunter gatherers, which is different than horticulturalists and herders, or like the Miao have become, is basically to balance their place, to include and to balance all aspects of it. And so, and on the right hand side there, basically the yin and yang serve to designate hot and cold, the moon and sun, soft and hard, feminine and masculine, death and life, and their complementary opposition exists in everything. And their alternation is the first law of Chinese cosmology. When yin reaches its apex, it changes into yang and vice versa. And so that's where you get the symbol from. But also they are interrelated. So where a shenya begins and ends, that's all kind of like it's fluid, and that's kind of representation of how they perceive and they move through their world. And it's again a model of how they look at the world. So I just wanted to put this out because, and just to remind us of that, because it's definitely integral to and central to the discussion about the Miao.
And also the idea that the cosmos, and we want to reflect that here on Earth, goes even back to the Paleolithic. There's really good evidence that there are star charts embedded in the Hull of Bull mural at Lascaux going back 20,000 years. Such a very ancient idea that's carried through.
I mean, Stonehenge, I mean, all sorts of
Yeah.
cycles and circles everywhere. And
Yeah.
you know, channeling or relating to cycles of the cosmos, the heavens. I mean, all of that. It's a different way of looking at things.
We have a very different relationship now to our cosmos. Yeah, nowadays. But
Yeah.
so what's this?
This is a ritual I documented, and if people are interested, they could email me or go to my website, and on the video page you'll see some of these documentaries. This is like a 20-minute documentary about the Han Nuo Wan, which is a Thanksgiving ritual, and the part of their training, these are badais, and part of their training, the guy in the center, of course, is the master badai, and the others are his assistants. The part of their training is the cut paper, and that paper represents the peach flower garden. And so they're in front of an altar. And then if you notice the bottom left there is rice cakes, there's incense, and there's also the yellow paper, which is the spirit money, and they're on top of masks, which are worn or used in some way, which represent the spirits that they're inviting in. Which will be worn by the various badais throughout the ritual performance, which begins. It's actually it's several weeks in the making, and then specifically they start organizing and maybe a few days before, and then they go into it heavily for the last 2 days, and then in the penultimate night is like 7 o'clock until dawn. Then it ends there, and dusk to dawn is pretty typical of a lot of rituals that move again into the darkness, into the night, because that's where and when the spirits are most vivid. Black is basically spirit light. I've been told a few different places, and that's how they see. They see better in the dark. They see it as a light, but a light of spirits. And so they're adept at moving through that. And you see he has these symbols in his hand, and playing throughout this are drums, cymbals, gongs, and chanting. They're all chanting here. So though they don't trance per se, as we understand trance, like very specific, I would argue that the entire event is a trance-like entrainment, not only for these men here, but also for the audience. I know myself, come around 3 o'clock in the morning, it's like I could be in another century. I have no idea where I am, and just because it just kind of takes me places, and it becomes just part of my body, and it's kind of like I'm in between spaces. So it takes the community and the audience there. And this is inside of someone's home who commissioned it. This Thanksgiving, someone was sick and they became well, and what they did is now they owed the spirits a festival, this ritual, in order to give thanks. And that's what it's about.
It's interesting, the idea that they say they're not trancing, but there's specifics to ritual itself, the steps of the ritual, the practice of the ritual. It's all contained in such a strong format of production that it's what induces their state, whatever they want to call it, in terms of whether they think of it just as a state of worship, or a state of honoring or whatever. But it's contained within the ritual. The power is in the ritual, is what they recognize. Absolutely, Paul. I agree. I mean, I was born and raised a Catholic in a Latin Mass type of church, and even now when I go there, though I don't practice as a Catholic, I go into a church, it just brings up a kind of embodied memories, things that have been encoded on me that take me, that's the space. And I can be in a church
by myself. Nonetheless, it evokes that because, and that's part maybe of that type of entrainment, that psychophysical body memory entrainment. Just our architectural spaces, not even nothing's playing. So basically, what's happening is, if you look at it as a narrative, a sacred narrative, a sacred script, they're essentially, again, reiterating and reaffirming and encoding for the community, which is a way of like taking stock in who you are, but also being encouraged. It's a comfort, right? So every gesture, chant, rhythm, word is very specified. And more times than not, these it can be explained where they came from and why they have to be specifically done. If they don't understand, in so many different cultural settings, I got back in interviews saying, we have to do it because that's the way it's done and the way the spirits decided. They don't understand it, but they just do it that way. And that's part of it, and that's why they do it, and they continue it. So it's kind of like something that came, as I'll talk a little later with some Nupak ritual. It came from trance. I mean, a lot of these rituals are evolved from and originate from someone essentially visioning and bringing that vision to the material world, and then the material world enacting it. As it's kind of like your dream. If you have a vivid dream, you bring it to the forefront and you play it out. You may not understand what that dream means, but you understand their significance enough that it has to be played in a certain way, that you can't rearrange it. And this is kind of
and then
like,
there's something to do with the embodiment of it.
Right.
yep. And that's where, this is where the poses come in, the trance poses. I mean, trance poses are embodied. They're part of it in a sense. He's actually, they're all doing steps. These are all steps that are related to the I Ching, which, to a viewer who's not initiated to understanding that, but they're all steps that are basically retracing the I Ching, which goes back to who knows where in its origin, but it has a sacredness. So again, it's a way of touching the world model of a place. It's flora, fauna, elements, climate, spirits, ancestors, all the non-human beings are touched and kind of evoked within this. In the background, if you can see there are two sacrificed pigs in the background. And that's part of like giving blood and giving to the spirits, what the wealth of what they have. And it's important that the host family actually raise the pigs and have invested in it their own like money, but also their own time and energy. It's transferred into.
So it's a meaningful gift.
Yeah. Right. So it's something they basically help create. And it's also, we can't forget, it's a social activity. We tend in the West to kind of think rituals are very like serious. Oftentimes, I mean, there's serious in it, but also there's a lot of levity and a lot of like casualness. It doesn't take away from it, because how do you stay serious if you're doing like a 10-hour ritual? So there's breaks, and sometimes it's a felt break. No one announces, hey, we're taking 10 now. It's just basically, okay, everyone's so attuned that they just kind of relax and they'll take a break. The badai may smoke or whatever and chit chat and tell jokes, and then someone just starts playing the gong again, and next thing you know, we're back into it. And likewise with the Bushmen, the same thing. It's like we just had a big break. They're going around drinking water or some drinking beer, and then we go back into it.
Not this hard division between daily life and sacred life.
Yeah, you're right, and that's important to note. It's like a porous thing. The ritual is a part of their life, and the life is part of the ritual. When you have that artificial barrier, you're kind of like psychologically saying it's there and I'm here, and the sacred and the secular are kind of like they're separated, they're firewalled somehow, which they're not.
This is part of the fabric.
I could have spiritual moments any time of the day. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And on the bottom, I put the badai basically means master offspring from the original badai. That's so they're basically descendants. Ancestry and ancestral worship and lineage is very important within this cultural context.
Which is a different concept than transcendent maiden.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Right. She the transcendent maiden does. Yeah. There again. This is the yin-yang. So they're the form people. They're the ones maintaining the spirits. If there are issues that the xianniang has, they'll go to a badai if it deals with like evil spirits coming in, because they know the form. But then the badai will go to the date of this ritual, for instance, was determined by a xianniang. And the fact that the family needed to, because the spirits or ancestral spirits talked to her to tell her that now is the time, it's overdue to do this ritual. You must do it now. And this is an ancestor talking to her. So what happens too is sometimes when a xianniang goes into trance, and if it's a big family, they're there for like 10 hours because they're channeling all the relatives that are dead.
Everybody's got a question.
Yeah, and each relative, you know, the brothers, the sons, you know, the brother-in-laws, the sisters, and the father, they all have questions for the ancestors. So some of the xianniangs complain that they have to, it's like, it's so exhausting because they're like channeling for hours. And the thing is, they don't remember anything. They have none of them have a recollection. They have a recollection of going in and understanding, but then when they actually start engaging with the ancestors, they just go blank. Whenever they transpose into an ancestor, then they have no consciousness. And it's in fact, they're fascinated by what people tell them what happened. So it's kind of interesting.
You know, when everybody talks about Edgar Cayce and his ability to go to sleep, the sleeping prophet, and then talk about very specific medical issues for the healing of whoever was asking, nobody compares this. Nobody compares Edgar Cayce to a tradition like this, where this is commonplace within that tradition. It's interesting. Same phenomenon.
Yeah, it may be interesting to re-examine that, you know, his work.
Not an isolated incident. It's this part of the human traditions. If you open it up, interesting.
Okay, so so role playing, as I showed you with the one xianniang, is real important in kind of like contacting and enacting an ancestor. So role playing is a way to make contact and interact with the non-human world. The shamanic seance essentially is the acquiring and passing of information from one world to another. So as a bridge, the ancestors or the spirits are basically giving information. The shaman creates and facilitates a state of interaction. So that's part of their job as well. I mean, and again, I'm talking functionalists. They're really pragmatic. People want to know information that's going to affect and adjust their life. Much like, you know, the psychotherapeutic applications of neo-shamanism are applied today. People want to know. It has to have a practical relevance. The mediator role is enacted in a ritual performance. So within the ritual, it's strengthened. And basically, I think you can go deeper if the trance experience is embedded within it, or the ritual itself is effectively a trance experience. And here, this is an archival slide from when I worked in Alaska. This is a Yupik shaman, Yupik Eskimo shaman, and he is wearing those hands, which essentially he's interacting. He's going to do battle with the bad guys. These are hunter-gatherers, and so there's a whole different dynamic. It's similar, but the dynamic is maybe, let's say, more engaged, like psychophysically, and demands a lot. And he's wearing a rain parka, which is essentially strips of walrus or seal gut sewn together. And so they'll use this when they're outdoors or kayaking, etc. But he's using it because of spatter. So when he does battle with the evil guys, what happens is he'll get spattered, and he doesn't want to be infected by the spatter when he, you know,
So it's a shield.
It's a shield, right? So it's kind of like it's
energy shield.
You're slicker. You know, you're gonna do some like battle, and there's gonna be bloodshed or some sort of like who knows what kind of effluvia that you need to kind of be protected. And then the mask is a mask. If you notice the teeth there, he's gonna go in the battle. And on his crest there, you see feathers, probably for an ability to fly in the sea. I'm not sure, this photo is not explicit enough for me to kind of determine. And I've done a lot of work with Yupik masks, which are really quite phenomenal. And I even work with the museum where I was able to put them on. So as a
Oh,
performer,
wow.
I can
Oh, wow.
see how they felt. You know,
Mm.
even though I have an Italian long nose, and they have shorter, stockier noses, and nonetheless, I could feel what and how I could move and how I looked at the world and what I could see. And it gave me a phenomenal insight, as did dancing, traditional dances.
What
So
insight did it lend you to
it,
wear these?
it's again, it's like it's a sensorial reality, and so the insight is maybe something that you can't really describe, but it kind of something I imbibed in my body, and it kind of changed me. I mean, as a performer, I don't understand everything, but I understood like how I'd react and how my head would move, and what I could see, and then how I would in mass training for Western theater, basically your body takes on the shape of the mask itself. You basically feel the mask through your cheekbones, and then the eyes here would probably be manifested in the shoulders or in maybe the chest area.
Mm.
The bigness in the spread of his hands are probably manifested in the teeth, in the wideness of the grin there. And so you start actually taking on the mask, and you find it in your body. And so it's like a total kind of like psychophysical transformation. So you become the mask, and that's how you transcend into that spirit.
I
Um,
also think there's the power of symbols, so that when you wear the feathers or the beak of a bird, you are aligning yourself energetically with the spirit of the bird and its superpowers to see farther, to fly, to gain a larger perspective. So I think symbolically there's some communication there as well
mhm.
with our senses, with the energies. So
I agree. I
I think
agree
they're very
totally.
powerful symbols. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all what we've been saying. It's all of that. Um, and but you won't find this kind of regalia with horticulturalists and herders, just because they are a step away from interaction with hunting animals for
Right.
subsistence.
The
And
relationship has changed with the animals. Yeah.
right, it becomes more aestheticized if they do have it, and
And they're
it's
more
no
focused
longer.
on plants as they move into agriculture.
Yep. In fact, I won't have time today, but there's one ritual that the water buffalo ritual, which I spent several days documenting. And Laura, I sent you like the article. It's a big article. If you didn't read, that's fine. But basically, it defines. It talks about how uh, they move through that ritual in a very different way than they do like a hunter gatherer. It's very much horticulturalist understanding of it. Um, you
And the
know,
role of a water buffalo in their egg. So, and
right.
I do read everything you send me, trust me.
Okay,
All very
okay.
interesting. Yeah.
Some of it's like really academic. I go, oh boy, who the hell wrote this?
Oh, bring it on. Yeah.
um, Now here is some work I did in Korea. This is like in the mid late 90s. I taught at their art university there. And then part of my interest was to document mudongs and shinbangs. Shinbangs are male and the mudongs are female. And it's a very, like the Miao tradition and other Asian traditions, highly Confucius related and organized. So the narrative accepts that every living being is made both physical and spiritual substance. So with the pig and like the oranges, etc. This is an altar on the left-hand side there. This is a personal altar in the home of a mudong. And she was a well-known and powerful mudong in the city of Incheon. And I was looking for, and regrettably, I don't have a photo of her, of the statues, but one of the statues he has is of Douglas MacArthur, um, he landed in Incheon during the Korean War, and he's known as like a spiritual savior of the Korean people. And so they'll interpolate, much like the Hopi will interpolate contemporary events and contemporary personalities that have had an influence on or interaction with the group. And
Which
so
makes sense if you see everything in mythic terms. Yeah, you would.
absolutely, it's like, yeah, it's both
Cultural heroes appear um, through current events. Yeah.
yeah, and that's exactly the point. So Only through trance can the shaman inhabit the same plane of supernatural forces. So this is something we know, but it's important to be reminded of. This photo here, this is part of an initiation. And one of the penultimate moments of the initiation is, and this pig has been degutted, so it's not as heavy as it may look. Its insides have been taken out. But what he's doing is essentially offering the pig for his initiate, for his spirits, his helping spirits, to accept her under his tutelage, and to for her career. Now, there's a whole story behind this woman who's basically, for years, she'd seen psychiatrists, etc. And then by chance, she went to a mudong by her mother's advice. And the mudong said, "You are a mudong. You're denying it. That's why you're having all these emotional and psychological issues." And so they found the right mudong, because they're all from different schools and practices. And this guy was chosen, and he initiated her. So he trained her for several years, and he initiated her. And here he's asking, as I mentioned, for his spirits to accept her as part of his under his tutelage, as his protege. You can't see it, but he's standing on two blades, and these blades are sharp, and he's barefooted. And
holding a heavy weight on his shoulders.
Heavy weight, absolutely. And he's in trance. He's totally in trance. And afterwards, I'm a skeptic. So afterwards, the blades were there, and I took a piece of paper out of my notebook, and it cut like butter. That thing was sharp, right? And I asked him to see the bottom of his feet. All he had were creases. And I had been told, I hadn't seen it, but if you're not fully in trance, especially. Now, the initiate does the same thing next. So if she was not fully accepted and fully entranced, she would have cut herself. And I've been told that some people don't make it, and they get really screwed up on their feet. They get cut. It slices them, and and you're unable to work and to move. So this is, I think I think a little later I show a little bit from that. Now I'll show from that.
And the other lesson is pay attention to those nudges in life that might be coming from a higher source as to what your destiny is, right? Yeah.
But what it asserts too is that biophysical entrainment that is actually has real world. It's not just something of the imagining. It's something that is actually works.
Testable, measurable.
Absolutely, it's in the world. And there are videos I could show you, people eating bowls, walking on hot pieces of metal, putting knives into their stomach and pulling it out with no marks, and then looking at the knife, within minutes and seeing it's not retractable. This is what the Bushmen. So there are things I to this day I can't explain, and only that they're in between spaces. And if you're doing that within that trance state, then something is either protecting you, or there's a porousness, and you're not really affecting the human body. You're basically a spiritual body at that point.
I had a psychic surgeon put his hand in my chest and pull out strings that he said were around my heart. I watched that. It wasn't a fake. Take that, James Randi. He was not wearing a rubber thumb full of red liquid. He actually stuck his hand in, pulled something out. I watched it, and there was no mark left. Maybe a little line, a red line.
Yeah.
I've witnessed it.
But how do you explain that? We don't, in a way, we don't even have the vocabulary because we're so bound to scientific materialist understanding and provability, which is slowly, like this guy with that you're going to bring on with the spirit, with the spinal fluids. It's, there's scientific studies that people are noticing. There's investigations that are saying that something happening that we can't really explain. And it's beyond the bounds of our perception, and maybe we need to expand our perception, which is a wonderful time and moment to be in right now in our world. We're
a lot of red flags demanding we expand that worldview. Yeah,
and what you guys are doing, Paul and Laura, basically is part of that change. It's in increments. It's in small measures, but it changes, and then the people viewing, or people who may see this in the future, or whatever, or anything you guys do, then it radiates and it moves through time and space, and you have no idea what effect it will have. but it's out there. And the fact that we're discussing it and doing a program like this, and you guys are continuing Felicity's work is part of that. So
Building bridges.
So kudos.
Kudos to you and your work.
Yeah.
And so many of our guests
Yeah.
here, all of them. Yeah.
It's fun to reach across that edge of looking into the unknown, what hasn't been proven yet, that we can dance in that part of the human experience as well, and that we look for evidence, but at the same time we know, like you said, not everything can be explained. We don't know. We just know that there's elements to the human story that continues to be revealed to us, and we continue the dance as we go along.
And the really fertile soil, the really fertile turf, is that edge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just kind of overwhelmed right now, but that's it's good. That's what keeps me going. I mean, it's exciting. I'm just
And that's why we
curious.
want to look at the ancient traditions to see what they have to say to us today to assist us in moving forward. And by the way, neo-shamanism gets so much criticism. And yet, I think it's doing exactly what you were citing at your very beginning, which is we must make these traditions relevant for today, relevant for who we are and where we're going. And that's what neo-shamanism is doing. It's the current ring in a very long chain. We're experimenting, we're playing it out, we're making it compatible with our needs, with our worldview, with who we are. We're continuing to push the seams of the envelope, and the ancestors are applauding it.
And being sensitive to cultural appropriation at the same time, but knowing that there's a new energy that's coming forth, and I recognize that
All of our traditions.
Without,
So make it new for us today so we can continue the path.
right.
What do you say to that, Thomas?
Well, we're talking about this slide, so we're all that's great. It's like it doesn't stand still. It's not a fixed phenomenon. It's unchanging. It has to change.
Right.
If it doesn't change, then it's no longer relevant, and then it just goes to the wayside. I mean,
Beautiful.
it's like an old pair of pants or something. I don't wear them anymore, so why do I keep them? So it develops and alters with social, economic, like neo-shamanism, and cultural evolutions of a given people. And because we're more individualized and more urban bound, then of course neo-shamanism takes on that form. It's no longer a kind of a village collective. We're no longer hunter-gatherers. So we adjust what we use, and we draw from those traditions and apply them as necessary.
Well, I think a key word today is eco-spirituality, and part of the wisdom that we're drawing on with what the work we're doing, direct experiences, all of life is sacred. The web of life is sacred. We're just one member on it. And the cosmos is the creative womb of life, and we're a part of that. And so it is resetting our relationship similar to what our early ancestors seem to have had. But it's resetting it for us moving forward and saying, let's not trash the planet anymore. Let's not destroy our ecosystem. Let's make it a habitation for all of us to flourish. That's the message for today.
Yeah.
We have to reset this relationship. It's helping us do that.
It's a growing voice of a message.
And we're all one family. That's another message.
We're all one community. I mean,
Yeah, it's all one world.
And we are becoming a bit more sensitized to spiritual selves, spiritual being, and then the spirituality and interconnectedness. All that's part of an emerging new old culture, new old sense of community.
Compartmentalization has run its course. Let's get back to the whole.
Yeah, it's the end of one historical cycle and the beginning of another.
Pendulum swinging, the big rethink is underway. It's an exciting time to be here.
I agree. This is the time. I think it's we're here because of a reason. So this here is Badai Shijinki. He became a dear friend of mine, and this is an initiation. This is like the first day I met him, and it was a 7-day. This is like the 6th day of a 7-day initiation of a badai line, and it was a strong hereditary line. The son had opted not to do it, had gone to the city, made money, etc., but then had misgivings and returned. But at that point his father had died, so he brought in this badai Shi Jinghe, who was a friend of this man's father, the initiate's father, to initiate him. into this line again. So basically to ask forgiveness and then to integrate him into his own line. This is in a house. This is maybe 2 in the morning at this point. I'll just show a little bit of this, but some of the gong work that we heard earlier or didn't hear, you'll hear it here. This guy is 70, at this point, like 76, 77. So he's pretty nimble. So I'll pause it here. I mean, this goes on for hours. At this moment specifically, if you notice, he's wearing like a mustache. That's actually a put-on mustache. It's the mustache of like a general or a hero. And he brings out this. It's a theatrical sword. It's not a real sword, but he's basically showing his might, because he's initiating this new badai. And he's basically saying that my strength as a badai and my spirits are very strong, and I have many generals and soldiers who are that come with me, and I am considered their hero. I'm a part of their group, and that I can withstand all sorts of assault, and that's why he's hitting himself, and then also why he can defend himself. So he's basically saying, bring it on, whatever you got, I'll take care of it. And then this is who you're dealing with, and this is what I'm passing on to this initiate. So he's basically, it's very, and they're very martial, again, because of their long history with the Han and the interaction with the Han.
And maintaining their cultural identity. It's also interesting, you said this was a house, and so you can create a sacred space, and that part of it is those symbols and those accoutrements that you put up to create a sacred space. A sacred space can be created anywhere because the portal can happen anywhere through the ritual, right? So
yeah, and the altar. And if you notice there, at the left-hand side, you see on the wall, there's like a Chinese film star, and so it's kind of like, that's what I mean about informality. And you saw earlier with the xianniang, you saw a Communist Party poster with Xi Jinping and Miao, et cetera. And you see those in every house. So it's kind of like this interesting kind of folding of different realities, and they're easily compatible. They don't contradict one another.
The fabric continues to get woven. Yeah. So.
And it comes back to that idea that, from Westerners, we have this idea that somehow to be sacred, we have to be serious, and we have to separate everything out. And there's no combination of the outer life and the inner life. It's two different worlds. But they continue. When you look at these traditions, over and over again, we see that the sacredness is contained within the life, within their homes, within their families, and their pets are running around the room. The kids are running and screaming. They're drumming.
Passerbys come in and witness.
Yeah.
So you're dissolving those boundaries.
Right.
Yeah. And so this boundary dissolving between ordinary and non-ordinary reality, that's transcendence, when those boundaries are dissolved. Right.
Yeah.
And also that you can have very much be anchored in this worldview, in the scientific worldview. It works. right? In our cultural view, it functions. But you can also have a foot in that other world. You can also see through both eyes simultaneously.
Yeah.
That's part of
Right.
being a full human being.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he was a healer. He's passed away, and I have some incredible video of his funeral, which rites, which was celebrated by some of the biggest badais in the region. But he would be the first to say there's certain things he can't heal. You should go to the clinic.
Yes.
That's their job. I do other things.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so they'll do it better. So he'll defer. So it's not like they're stuck in one way of like perceiving.
You
make friends in interesting places, don't you, Thomas?
Well, a quick anecdote. When I interviewed him, he was doing these hand gestures, which are basically ways of like communicating with the spirit world, but also ways of like opening up and unlocking doors in the spirit world, which for me, excuse me, implies trance, right? And I asked in the interview, and like my friend Peng Jingquan, he says, it's very sacred, you know. So I deferred. About a week later, he found me. I have no idea how, in a hotel room in this other, maybe like 70 miles away, a village. And he knocked on the door, my door. And I go, hi, I mean, what are you doing here? And I had to get Peng down the hallway. And he said he wanted to show me the hand gestures.
Oh.
And he said, because my tradition is dying and I don't want this information to be lost.
Wow.
And so, you know, we spent hours and I videotaped and he explained each hand gesture, which normally would have been, you know, sacred and only privileged to an initiate. I don't know how to use them. I know of them within the context, of course. I don't know how to use them. But he shared them. And we just gave him
documentarian,
and bought some rice cakes, and we just went on and on.
Very cool.
It'd be very interesting to have Fred Smith look at that and compare it to the Vedic mudras, hand gestures. Wouldn't it?
I've seen in India similar but different use of gestures. The hand. Hands are really important. Hands are where, in many traditions, where spirits can enter and exit. And so some traditions that have to cover the hands, the Yupik tradition that cover the hands, they'll have hands with holes in them in their iconography. You'll see that various places. That means that's a passing through. So hands are and like healing hands, all these things, energy. And when you put your hand on someone's shoulder or in their face, you shake hands, there's an energy exchange there. So hands are quite significant in spiritually.
We see them showcased in various postures that we use, and we see hallmarks of hand positions from posture to posture.
Right. Cave walls across the
crossing the chest, open, all that.
And Paul's pointing out when you see in cave walls the handprints. Touching the veil, the separation between the realms. Wow. Well, this is what makes us so human, our manual dexterity.
Oh, okay, here you go. Let's see. I won't. I tell you right now, I will not get through everything.
Okay, part two. Should we break right?
Ambitious.
Okay. Yeah.
Well,
but I know we have comments from people to take and interaction that you want to have.
And you're not even halfway through, are you? I mean,
and maybe we can find a place where I can stop today and then really entertain questions rather than rush through. The second half basically goes through the narrative sequence. My step by step, the narrative sequence, and then making comparative analysis, cultural comparisons.
Oh, wow, I want to hear that.
So maybe this is something from the Makande people in southern Tanzania. I taught at the University of Dar es Salaam for a while, and I spent time in Tanzania, which is a very different tradition.
I want to read your memoir one of these days.
So the trance journey, as we know, those who have done the postures, it's a journey. And as you become more adept at it, there's a narrative that evolves within it. And there's a continuity, at least for me, when I trance, it's a continuity between various journeys from one to another. There are certain sites that are revisited or certain spiritual entities that encounter and reenact, things or lessons told. I'm familiar within that geographical location. Where that came from is probably culturally bound. In fact, most decidedly culturally bound. So it is a narrative. And then essentially, again, and I'm reiterating here, the ritual itself is a trance journey narrative. If you look at it broadly, it's on a scale of like 1 to 10, it's probably like a 4 or 3, maybe it increases to like a 7 at times, depending on the culture as far as trance intensity. But nonetheless, it is a trance narrative. So the gradual alternation of consciousness induced by sensory stimulation, serving a psychophysical mechanism to enter an alternative reality. So basically, it takes you in stages, much like a narrative does, like a film or a play in the Western context. It goes in stages and takes you deeper into the subtext, into the characters, into subplots, et cetera, and the complexity of the situation. It does that, but in a psychophysical, spiritual way rather than a material kind of psychological way. For the West, our default setting of interpretation, our lens is essentially psychology. So we look at things as personal, individual motives and then how they link up. And that's what interests us. And that's what we focus on. And that's kind of maybe psychology can be argued as an inheritor of spirituality. What used to be called a spiritual movement, the gods or spirits moving, as now we say is a chemical movement or imbalance or something that happened to us when we were young, abuse or traumatizing experience. And then that spirit got
We like cause and effect. Yeah.
Right. So it's how we term it and how we envision it and frame it, which is different. But we're basically doing the same thing, but in different terms. We're just framing it differently.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So the narrative within the narrative, all right, the trance within that reinvigorates the ritual narrative. So the fact that you can enter into a real state or semi-state of trance in the ritual actually reinvigorates the ritual narrative. So you almost need it, the kind of like the transportation or kind of like the porousness between realities. Those passages need to be opened in order to be invigorated. If it gives you nothing, if you go to a church and you get nothing from it, then why are you going? I mean, you need some sort of like insight, reflection, some sort of stimuli, something, a calmness, whatever. You have to gain something.
Well, we love story, don't we? We're geared to story.
So the depth of engagement depends on the intensity of role taking and role performance. So roles are really important. So this is the performative aspect of it, in the fact that this man, he is a dancer. This is actually a fertility ritual. And he is, it's a mask, a traditional, they call it a helmet mask. And it's a ritual where it's basically the man takes an interest and some sort of action to assure fertility of the woman that he's with. So that's what he's dancing for. So it's showing, in a way, it's a yin-yang type of arrangement. In fact, that we don't really, in our own American culture, the man takes maybe a scant interest in the woman's fertility unless she can't be fertile. But here, to assure and also the birth of a healthy child is also a part of the energy that the man has to perform and to put out into the world. So that's part of what that's about.
Prep the bed before you put the seed there. Okay.
Yep. So there's a shared responsibility. And so he's taking on a role. He's taking on a role not of himself, but of like an archetypal figure within the Makonde tradition. And that's carrying it forward. So let's see. All right. So now this is where I begin the ritual, and I don't know how many slides more left, but I do go into the actual sequence of events one by one.
Let's hear it. We got to hear this.
It'll take a while.
Do you think it's something we can do in 20 minutes, or do you something you think is going to take longer?
I mean, if I rush through it, because I have video. I try to I think it's really important to have video. But let me start. How's that?
Okay. What do you think,
and-
Paul? Do you think we have time?
Well, of course, we can continue a separate discussion and a new discussion.
Do you want to do it today, or do you want to do part
What would you prefer, Thomas?
3 at a
I
later
mean,
date?
what I can do if I come back, I can maybe focus on this and then augment
Okay.
it with more detail.
That'd be
Okay.
fine.
Would you be
'Cause
willing
this
to?
is an abiding
do
interest
that?
of mine, and it's something I'm always adding to.
Okay.
But and it goes through preparation of the audience is as the starting point. And now you'll see this with the Chukchi, you'll see it with the Yakuts, and Saha, you'll see it with the Bushmen. They're all doing the same thing, even with the Shenyas and the Badais. There's always this preparation, and we're intention, and you do the same with the postures. Intention stated, atmospheres stated, blessed and protected. Where you're doing smudging or whatever, or asking spirits to come in, their role and expectations are identified, or either psychologically or mentally. And you may include active participation, repeating verses, affirmations, rhythm, music. All these things can be shared.
Yes.
And a shaman has the ability to regulate social relations in the community. So now the shaman's role becomes more communal and more social, organizational. As well as spiritual. So again, we see frames of reference kind of overlapping and intertwining.
We say creating a safe container for the work.
Yep, and that's again what the ritual is. It's a safe container. You can go further with a safe container, and you can go, I think, deeper with a safe container, with intentionality and also with understanding how it fits into this cosmology. Which I think, and I haven't done enough research on it, but I'm sure many of the postures existed within a ritual context. That there was a moment for them. That it wasn't just like, hey, let's just do this one today. I feel like it, but rather that it had a ritual context which elaborated and deepened the impact of it.
Oh, indeed. Yeah. It
So
was
what
part
they were, who
of a
knows?
longer ritual.
Yeah, and probably one of those, something very involved.
Beginning, middle, and end. Yeah, there's
Yeah.
a whole arc to it. Yeah.
Well, it's
So
like-
there's a whole process of re-engineering and understanding and kind of reorganizing an understanding of how it took place.
the hero journey.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm looking now, it's like 12:44. We could pause here and I can come back. And what I can do then is maybe talk about this sequence, but then go into a parallel understanding of how it relates to performance.
Beautiful.
And maybe my own performance. I sent
I want to
you-
understand this in depth.
Yeah. I don't want you to
Yeah.
be rushed. And then obviously I'm pulled both directions because I'm so fascinated about this discussion. I want to continue. At the same time, I want to make sure you have enough time to do it correctly. So why don't we schedule another one, and that'd be fantastic. And then we'll
Yeah.
go into depth, and that will allow you time to prepare that for a specific presentation. And
And this is so pertinent to our community house.
Oh, this is so
program as
much
well.
what we're talking about
Yeah.
is just the steps
look
of
at it
ritual.
from
What
this
is
angle.
ritual? How do we define ritual? How Goodman looked around the planet and said, well, these are some of the steps of ritual that are contained culturally. And what if we remove the cultural overlay and go down to what are the basics that
She was always looking for the essential steps.
What are the essential steps? And that's what you're already touching on right now.
And also, it's not abracadabra. It's not like a magic word. It's the entire ritual. It's the entire sequence of events in the
Right.
ritual. It's the cues to the body and the brain and the mind and the soul that all produce this effect. It's a dance. It's theater. It's so much of what you do.
Well,
Yeah.
we do have a few questions in the chat room while we were going today. And we probably,
Well, I just want to say congratulations on all your
That's
work
important.
and what you've done. You've really taken theater to new levels in all the work that you do. You've taken the study of the ancient traditions that you look at to new levels. So
Thank you.
really glad that you're doing what you're doing.
So glad
and
we found you.
sharing it
Yeah.
with us.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Thank you to Bo Hell for introducing us.
Yeah, Bo is the one.
Oh,
yeah.
my gosh.
Yeah, I like to meet you guys in person one day.
Please.
Maybe
Look forward to that. Yeah.
drum with Paul. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, we'll come to the Institute or come here too. We're both places. Yeah. Well,
Or
let me
we should
see.
go there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And Tracy asked the question: did they establish pairs, male and female, as a shamanic team, or do they work independently? So they work with different partners when they go into the community to perform a service.
Generally, a village will have one or two badais, and likewise one or at least one, possibly two shenyas. So, and they'll it doesn't. I don't think it's formalized, but they'll definitely work with one more specifically than another, just because they're in a sense they live in the same village, and they maybe have a longevity of experience together. And as I mentioned, many times a shenya's let's say father or son is a badai, and
Mm.
so they'll work together kind of like out of like a family type of understanding,
Yeah.
Next
or
question.
they'll call on one for specific needs, for instance.
Specialists.
Yeah.
And
In a different
And
area.
Dory made the comment, she says, I'm just struck with how similar these practices are with indigenous American tribal dances to invite and embody spirits and spirits with nature and all the elements are there. And that's like coming back to that idea that the universality of it. Yeah, absolutely. Let me see what else. Let me see. Tony said, specific burial practices associated with jade. He says it's a personal question he has because his great grandfather spent much of his later half of his life studying and collecting in China.
Uh-huh.
And
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
and
Interesting.
he was fluent in two dialects, and his collection's now at the Baltimore Museum.
Oh,
Yeah,
Tony, you've been holding out on us. We didn't know that story.
yeah.
So, and who wants to jump on their mic and pose a
Well,
question
I
as
think
well?
we can do it in a formal
But
way.
honor the
But,
chat room. So what else?
Well, go ahead,
Go
Tony.
ahead, Tony. Yeah.
yeah, uh, did you get into burial practices, and would there be any relationship?
um I've only seen a few burial practices. Yeah, but yeah, I hadn't seen enough maybe to comment on it. But I've been to burial rituals, and as I mentioned, the one Bade, Shi Jinghe, when he died, it was interesting. Um, his body did not decompose for like a month after his death, and part of the burial ritual around him was to seat him in a chair with an open roof so his spirit can escape. And the other Bades came from far and near because he was such a powerful master, to celebrate his life, but also to send him off for a place in heaven, to be a spirit to help other Bades. So he was kind of
Ah,
like basically placed there. That's what they were doing with his burial ritual. And then also I saw it's Tuja, which is related to the Miao, a burial ritual, which they call the direct translation is unwinding a life, and then how they would bring someone would enact the deceased, and they would take the Bade would take the person through the high points of their life, much like when we have like a service for someone who is like adulating their life or remarking on various moments we had with that person in their life, so kind of high points we had
like
with
a
them.
life review.
So what they'll do is the community will basically go through the high points, and they're unwinding. And so what they're doing is basically going in a circle, like clockwise, and then they'll stop and they'll recite each moment of that person's life, which is gathered from the community, right, and made into again a narrative. And then it's circle wind into the center, and then they leave that person at center, and then they counterclockwise, the Bade will leave, and so leave that spirit at the center. So now everything's been resolved.
Wow. Huh.
Uh,
So
Very,
that's what those are only two that I really kind of experience and can comment on.
and that have a ritual to them with a purpose. Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you. This is also interesting. I've heard all sorts of pearls. I love Trance as a journey, and I love Black is Spirit Light. These are just I want to process. They could have all sorts of interesting manifestations. So
yeah.
thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Who else?
Stephanie had a couple questions I thought were really interesting. She said,
Stephanie, do you want to jump
well,
on?
let me read the two questions and she can jump on and follow up. Number one is she said, when you present the concept of ecstatic trance postures, when you travel, are you sharing this concept to other cultures, or are you seeing something similar? And then she also asked the question, are you seeing anything that you would consider a posture, an artifact that represents a posture position in your travels, since you're familiar with how the whole works?
I would say in Alaska. Oh yeah.
In Alaska.
Yeah, in Alaska especially. More hunter-gatherers, I'll see the postures rather than horticulturalists. Horticulturists have forms, but the postures are definitely hunter-gatherer. So I do see them in my travels. And in the way I use them in my theatrical work is, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, is I extrapolate what so I'm working in a culture for several months, or return, and a few times, but draw out these kind of like these patterns, these performance patterns, and then that becomes a vocabulary by which we interpret contemporary issues. So it's a process I call body, space, and place. So the first is like activating the body language, the vocabulary, and then understanding the spaces that they live within, and then creating in the performance a place, a temporary zone or form of that place, and that's a performance. So that's kind of like the process. But so I've used extensively the trance postures, and we've created entire scenes. Much like following the prototype in indigenous cultures, entire scenes are created from the trances. We know sometimes we don't understand what they are. We just go, there's something there, or maybe three different people had a similar idea, and then a canoe starts happening when we start trancing over a period of time. A group of people, like I'm thinking of, in Siberia I trance, in Africa also, with a ritual group in Russia. What happens is people start trancing together after a while. And so they start seeing similar images, and they start actually encountering things that are interrelated. And so then we just play with them and understand and kind of bring them to life. And then it's like, whoa, what do we have here? And then we start, how do we activate this? And someone else will say, I heard this, or I saw this movement. And then we just start kind of putting it together and seeing what happens and just trusting ourselves. But there are performances, sections that I still to this day don't understand, but were deeply affecting.
Yeah. That's interesting.
So your role is really listening and looking at what's emerging and staying in the moment and staying present and looking at the dynamics and helping it be articulated and manifest. You have such an interesting role. You're listening to both realms and seeing what wants to emerge.
And that was part of the discovery of Dr. Goodman as well. Was she did the mass trance dance, and she would take all of the experiences of the group and she would journal. We continue this ourselves now, but she would journal and keep track, and she would even take time to type it all up and
what
make
are your visions? What did you see?
And integrations of the experiences, laying on an entire
a narrative actually that had a coherent beginning, middle, and end, and it wasn't the product of any one person. It wasn't a product of the intellect. It was the pieces tied together from the visions that became the narrative. It emerged and coherent and had meaning, so that each part added to the whole. It was the sum of the parts that was stunning. And you're also, I always say that caves are the cathedrals, the museums have become our secular cathedrals. So is the theater stage where this takes place. These are our modern day cathedrals and temples and sacred spaces in our secular society. They're the spaces of transcendence. Just as you're doing all the enactment of it.
Yeah. My position, we've basically abdicated that role as a theater artist. We've abdicated that role to other mediums, and that it can be a central place. I'm going to Czech Republic Monday, or tomorrow, and I'll be there for 2 weeks. I'm giving a talk in Brno at a theater school, which is the topic is the future of performance. And essentially, it'll be talking about some of these issues of how do we look at another prototype rather than kind of like beating this older operating system, which is not responding to the needs of our moment in the world. So how do we kind of like re-engineer who we are, our talents? Because people are frustrated. Artists are frustrated. It's like they're looking for another way of like conceiving the world and expressing the world that we're in. But we're limited by the
And that's
language.
their job of the artist right there.
Yeah, that's right. So
They need more venues, and they're creating them. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
It's a
But
living
we can
tradition.
also return to the ancient venues and understand that the theater, the cave, these were sacred spaces.
Sometimes it's just
And
intuitive and not
let's
knowing
make them
the ancient,
so again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, the ancient foundation, but there's that rediscovery happening. So because it's constantly evolving, just like you said, shamanism is not a static, dead thing. It's moving, and like that reflection into the field of art, whether it's the theater or
And one can illuminate
dance
the other in these
yeah.
new ways.
Yeah, very exciting.
Exciting.
And of
So-
course, Tony's asking what's happening next. You just mentioned that. Your website is thomasriccio.com. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
One word.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
then there's some more
Oh.
videos and things you can check out there as well. Yeah.
There's so much to cover. The Dead White Zombies, a commentary for our day, the theater group that you do. So well named. So well named. So, okay.
So anyway, I think that the idea here and the power of your work and having access to your travels and research, and we can synthesize that. We can try to embrace
Share
that.
notes along the way.
Because
Yeah.
like we say in the very beginning of these presentations, it's about us opening ourselves to better understand where we fit in. What is it about the trance work? What is it about the Goodman discovery here, the rediscovery?
Something amazing's happening. What
What's
is it?
going on? And
Yeah.
let's not put on our blinders and think that this, we need to know. We need to see. And when you show us these video clips, when you show us the research and you share the stories, it's opening our eyes to the reality of, yes, and we get really excited, like, we experienced that. We know that. We're familiar with that somehow through direct experience, even though we haven't done the homework to know that it exists in the way that you're discovering. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I agree,
Yeah.
Paul.
And what did you do at the Zeus Island in Greece? And you went into a cave and you had another performance. That's intriguing.
Actually, it was the Duragi Cave. It's called Duragi Cave. We essentially resonated with the cave. I mean, that was the whole idea. It was something. It wasn't my initiation. It was a friend of mine who invited me, and it was hard to resist because it was an art residency on Kefalonia, which is one of the Greek islands in the summer. So, good way to spend August. But essentially, we resonated sonically, and so I played the role of the caller to call the spirits in, using rhythm and vocalization. So I do vocalization as well, and then the others came, and we basically resonated with the cave and the history of the cave itself, the earth. Basically, it was the earth. And to kind of align with it. So I mentioned about synchronizing with the rhythm of a place. The idea was to synchronize with that place that we became. It ran through us, which was it was a simple kind of maybe exploration exercise that we did rather than a big narrative. It was just simply confined to like one object and to move from there.
What did you pick up from the cave itself and Mother Earth?
It's kind of like one of those sensorial things. It's a beautiful cave.
Hard to put into
As
words.
I mentioned, it was discovered in 1953 when there was a big earthquake and it opened up. So it's kind of like, and it's deep within the earth. You have to go pretty far down to get there. And it's not that large, but it's like a large cathedral, and it has a large circular playing space in a sense, which is rocked. And then all sorts of nooks and like levels and bridges and stuff where we sonified and we moved throughout the space to basically talk to the cave. So it goes back to like the decentering of the human and an understanding of interacting and communicating with non-human beings. So this is like an exploration that I've wanted to encounter. So how do you talk to something that's like a cave, which has a history and which is, many traditions call rocks the skeletons of the earth. They'll be here a lot longer than we will be, and they have knowledge.
Well, and also, what did those first people who walked into the celebrated caves that we know that were so highly decorated and used as cathedrals and temples, what was their first experience there? How did they go about activating it and resonating with the cave through similar ritual, I would imagine, through similar process?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Let's align with our energies and see what needs to happen here. So
For me, it was to create like a cycle
yeah.
to resonate with the cave, and the cave to resonate in me, and to kind of like move it that way. That was my objective.
Right.
And people were taken by it. So, and it's not meant to be a narrative to have an intellectual effect, the more affective, sensorial reaction.
I want to go back to the Bernafal cave in southern France and do ritual there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's do it. So coming back to this question, because it's a very important question in today's world, and that is the question of cultural appropriation. Tracy's re-asked that question. Laurie Snyder's following up on the same question, talking about, are there critics of you about cultural appropriation? How do you walk that fine line? I know. I'm just in defense of Dr. Goodman. She worked directly culturally and had permission for what she did. It was not. She was not appropriating anything. She worked directly with Pueblo people when they wanted to share something with her. Fine. She didn't ask. They would share, and like that, her research and her work was based on the fact that she had that relationship.
But
she wasn't just taking
made it clear that there was nothing about our work in the Pueblo tradition.
Right.
She just happened to have a
As
summer
one
home
example.
there, and
Right.
there was no crossover.
So Thomas, to you, that question.
I tell you, I've never sought any of my work. I've been brought in. I've been asked to come in, and I'm always in association with, and many times I'm paid by local entities. And because I think it's maybe I'm unique in that I've worked with so many different cultures that I'm not interested in appropriating. I'm interested in actualizing, and I document things and ethnographically, and whether it's video, audio, in written form, articles, and which are given back to any information I have is given to a local entity, whether it be a museum or a cultural trust or whatever. But it's by happenstance I've been invited. So people will call me and it's like, can you come and work? It's like, who are you? It's like, okay. And then, I find out months later, they have funding and when can you come? So it's not like, and I've asked, this is a question that kind of like, it didn't trouble me. It was just kind of curious, but I've asked a few people, and I mentioned the Mudong that I worked with in Incheon, and she goes, because this is what you need to do. It's like, what brought me to her, of all people, by a friend of a friend. And it's like, well, can you come meet her? I mentioned you to her, and she said, can I meet? And then like, okay, I'm there. So it's like, I don't, and the advantage, it's like I'm insider outsider. There's another aspect to it. What happens too is, because I do my due diligence and research, and I work in these cultural contexts enough that I maybe have like a decorum that I understand how far I can go with it and how to interact. But I can also use the fact that I can say things that an insider can't, or you actually see things that an insider can't. Yeah. So oftentimes it's a weird kind of turnaround. I'll mention something to, let's say like the Zulu, and I'll go, how do you know this? It's like, well, I was just curious. And they go, and then so they go back and ask in their village, because they're in Durban or someplace, and they'll ask in their village and they'll find out more about it. Because if this white man from the power culture is asking, maybe I should know something, so, and that's, so it's interesting. And then another time with, when I worked in Saha, is like they were changing, we had collectively evolved based on their tradition, a performance based on a well-known mythology for their national theater. And then towards the end, they started changing it. And it's like, why are you changing it? It's because we are afraid of what we're saying is too powerful for our community.
Yeah.
And that, and that we live here. I go, just tell them the American director insisted you do this. Because I go, what do you want to do? We want to. They go, yes, that gives us an out. So it's kind of like weird. It's
told me to do it.
Just blame me, because I understood they're and they said very strong things that they wanted to say as artists, but they're hesitant because they have to live within that social context.
Well, and also when a friend of yours comes and says, I want you to see and to document and to record and to videotape
Right.
my knowledge of the hand movements that is part of this tradition, they are, and you're saying they don't want to learn the literate way of the power culture. They don't want it to interfere with their own direct relationship with this space.
Right.
Then they might depend upon us to document some things.
Right.
That's a value. That's a value to document respectfully and wholly. That's part of our jobs.
Yeah,
Is when asked.
I work with a Greenlandic group, and they got the first brunt of colonization in North America from the Danes, right? And so that on one side of Greenland, because of the ice flows, the east side, it was basically wiped out, right? So they had no idea. But since I had worked in Alaska and knew Alaska Native dance, when I did this workshop with them, I says, what else can I give you? And they go, can you teach us how to dance? I'm an Italian American from Cleveland, and I'm teaching them Eskimo dance to Greenlanders because they lost their dance. So it's kind of like, it's a strange, and of course I'll give you what I have. That's all, and I give it freely. What was given to me was not for me to keep, but to give away generously. So it's kind of this maybe flow. I don't know. There are people concerned about appropriation, and I realize but it's like, I'm not making money on this.
Right.
It's like I'm not making a living, on this. It's a good thing I have a job. You know what I mean?
Well, it's sort of a double-edged sword. We had the great pleasure of knowing Vine Deloria Jr. And in discussions, he said, the problem is, he says, our people, of course, we've been burned and ripped off, and everything's been happened by the white guys, and so we don't want to tell them our sacred traditions and knowledge. But at the same time, if we don't help these people, what are they going to do to the planet? What are they going to do with this?
For the ones that need the
we
most
get to give
help.
them some direction. We have to give them some rituals. We have to give them some knowledge. We have to do something. We can't just continue to be so afraid that it's going to be ripped off again. And so he was walking that line as a scholar, saying we have to share. At the same time, these guys are infants. These white guys, we have to take them in
We've
baby
lost
steps.
our way.
Yeah, baby
Help
steps.
them back.
They're not ready for the full-on medicine,
Yeah.
but they need some medicine.
Or we just met Carol Beckwith and her partner Angela Fisher, who spent 40 years
40
traveling
years in
on
Africa.
donkey, on foot, with cameras,
Right.
photo and film, photographing the ceremonies, the costumes, the way of life, the day-to-day of so many African cultures, 40% of which they say have disappeared.
They no longer exist,
and so
but
that's
they documented
such a valuable
it. Yeah, right.
archive.
That's a good point. And they're coming up with another discussion soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But-
these, I guess our records are important.
Right. So we
Yeah.
play a role, and there's a sensitivity. And
At the same time, one of the beautiful museums in British Columbia of the First Nations people is closing a gallery
Right.
because they need to
just-
reset it and take away the dominant culture narrative. So, there's some corrections that need to take place.
There's a political correctness happening, which is appropriate, but at
we
the
need
same
to
time-
equalize the
yeah,
playing field.
Right.
Yeah. So,
In January, I'll know that the kivyuk is being presented in Barrow because I'll get emails, sometimes phone calls, because I wrote about it. And they'll go, on the third day, do you do this or this? So start asking me a question, about a ritual that is basically because I for whatever reason, I recorded it and I documented elders who are no longer around, and I had information, so I share it.
So if the power culture has taken so much away, give us a chance to give back in what way that we have the tools.
I tell them what I know. That's it.
Yeah. So it's that's where this whole thing lies, and still Laura and I holding up the tent pole for
This little
Felicitas-
space.
Yeah, for this space, for Felicitas Goodman's space and her contributions. It's a wonderful honor, but it has sensitivities, and fortunately, we understand that it's the foundation of it is allowing for that evolution, for the thing to speak for itself. If it truly is a tradition that comes from this world of spirit, then it's going to continue in its own way, and then we have to do our best to bring it forth and get out of the way when necessary to allow that thing to be.
Well, also, Goodman spoke around the world at conferences, at symposiums. She had
Right.
colleagues and
Right.
friends. And so this is our recreation of that
Right.
dialogue
Sure.
here, is
Yeah.
to invite the scholars and
To come to us.
the experts and the people doing these interesting bodies of research to come and continue the dialogue.
Yeah, we're avoiding the airports. And
It's our way of traveling right now. So,
Well,
anyway.
yeah, I think we've really have had a tremendous discussion today, Thomas. Like the first time with you, and now we have a third
And like
one.
the third time.
The third time's
up.
coming.
When do you get back
Um,
from your
The
travels?
28th of November.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, we'll book through December anyway, but so it'll be first of the year. We'll
First
have
of the
another
year.
discussion.
Yeah,
Sure.
we'll
Okay.
schedule that. We
That
look
would
forward
be-
to that.
That'd
Yeah.
be great.
Yeah.
And what's the greatest insight from your work directly with these shamanic cultures? What's your biggest insight or message for us in the West?
It's natural.
Thank you.
It's really natural. It's just part of
Who we are.
Yeah.
It's part
And
of
it's
the flow.
so odd that we've shoved that off the table, that we've pushed that aside, that we've denied that. I think that's the biggest message too, is that this is who we are and have been and always will be and will be again quite soon. This is part of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So-
just
I agree with you.
Just be yourself. I mean, and just be open, and it comes to you, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That veil is
It's all
not.
there. It's all there already. It's all there.
That is such a key insight.
Yeah.
It's all there. That veil is very thin, and it does not take much to open up the passageway.
Absolutely.
So, thank you, Thomas.
Thank you
Appreciate
very much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.